History prefers clean endings. It likes victory parades, signed documents, and clearly defined villains brought to justice. But the real history of the Second World War does not end neatly in May of 1945. It dissolves, instead, into silence, into sealed archives, into laboratories that were dismantled overnight, and files that vanished before anyone could read them. Beneath the familiar narrative of tanks and treaties lies another conflict entirely, a war waged not on battlefields, but on human bodies and minds. A war so morally corrosive that even its architects understood it could not be allowed to survive the collapse of the Reich. By the late 1930s, Germany had already crossed a threshold. Science, once bound by ethics inherited from centuries of medical tradition, was redefined as a tool of state power. The Hippocratic Oath became irrelevant when measured against racial ideology and military necessity. Doctors were no longer healers, they were technicians of efficiency. Patients were no longer individuals, they were material. And suffering was no longer a tragedy, it was a resource. The concentration camps, initially designed for political repression, evolved into something far more sinister. They became controlled environments, isolated from scrutiny, where variables could be manipulated without consequence. Hunger, cold, fear, and exhaustion were not side effects, they were deliberately engineered to weaken resistance. Within these environments, human experimentation flourished, not in chaos, but in bureaucratic order. Every procedure was logged, every reaction timed, every death categorized. In Dachau, hypothermia experiments unfolded with chilling precision. Prisoners were stripped naked and submerged in ice water, while physicians observed from a distance, recording the gradual shutdown of bodily functions. As core temperatures dropped, subjects entered phases of confusion, violent agitation, hallucination, and finally collapse. Attempts at rewarming were tested using methods ranging from boiling water to sexual contact, not out of compassion, but to determine efficiency. Many did not survive the revival process. Those who did were often returned to the water to repeat the cycle, until their bodies could no longer respond. Nearby, altitude experiments simulated the conditions faced by Luftwaffe pilots. Pressure chambers reduced oxygen levels to the equivalent of extreme altitudes, inducing seizures, hemorrhages, and catastrophic organ failure. Witnesses later described prisoners clawing at their own throats, begging for air, while doctors debated whether panic accelerated death. Autopsies followed immediately. Brains were weighed, lungs examined, hearts dissected, not to save lives, but to refine thresholds of survivability. Yet physical pain alone was not the ultimate objective. The true ambition of Nazi experimentation lay in domination of the human will. Researchers believed that modern warfare required not only superior weapons, but controllable soldiers and compliant populations. Psychological experiments sought to identify the breaking point of identity itself. Prisoners were subjected to relentless interrogation, isolation, and sleep deprivation. Lights burned continuously, voices repeated commands without pause. Days blurred into weeks, memory fractured. Some prisoners began responding only when spoken to, others lost the ability to speak at all. Chemical manipulation followed. Experimental drugs were administered without consent, sometimes disguised as vaccines or nutritional supplements. Stimulants induced manic obedience, sedatives erased resistance, hallucinogens dissolved perception. Doctors observed how quickly subjects accepted new realities when their sensory input was altered. The goal was not persuasion, but surrender, the creation of humans who no longer questioned instruction. Genetic experimentation pushed the program into irreversible moral collapse. Under the guise of racial science, entire bloodlines were reduced to datasets. Twins were prized not as individuals, but as comparative instruments. In Auschwitz, children were injected with foreign substances to provoke infections. Eyes were dyed chemically in attempts to alter pigmentation. Limbs were amputated to observe differential healing. When experiments concluded, subjects were often killed so their organs could be examined together, eliminating the inconvenience of long-term survivability. Sterilization experiments expanded beyond the camps, targeting civilians across occupied Europe. X-rays were used to destroy reproductive organs. Chemical injections caused internal burns and permanent damage. Victims were rarely informed. Many learned the truth only years later when they were unable to have children. The intent was not secrecy, but scale, a quiet, efficient reduction of populations deemed undesirable.
As Germany's military position deteriorated, the experiments intensified. Desperation replaced caution. By 1944, orders circulated to eliminate witnesses. Records were destroyed. Entire wards were evacuated or sealed. Prisoners who had survived months of experimentation were executed to prevent testimony. Some facilities were dynamited. Others were simply abandoned, their contents left to rot behind locked doors. When Allied forces liberated the camps, they found remnants, instruments without explanations, bodies without names, fragments of reports without context. The full scope was already gone. What survived was enough to horrify, but not enough to reconstruct the entire machinery of suffering. Justice, when it came, was selective. At Nuremberg, a handful of doctors stood trial. Their crimes shocked the world, but they represented only a fraction of those responsible. Many others vanished into an anonymity or were quietly recruited. The Cold War had begun, and the calculus had changed. Data extracted from human agony was considered too valuable to discard. Through programs like Operation Paperclip, former Nazi scientists were relocated, rebranded, and absorbed into Western research institutions. Their past were sanitized, their victims erased. A similar bargain was struck with Japan's Unit 731, whose biological warfare experiments rivaled the worst atrocities of the camps. In exchange for exclusive access to their findings, the United States granted immunity to researchers who had conducted live vivisections and mass infection trials. Justice was traded for advantage. Silence became policy. For the survivors, liberation did not mean closure. Many emerged physically broken, psychologically shattered, and socially invisible. Their testimonies were often dismissed as exaggerations or trauma-induced delusions. Some could not articulate what had been done to them. Others had been conditioned to doubt their own memories. The experiments had not only destroyed bodies, but erased narratives. The legacy of these crimes shaped the modern world. The Nuremberg Code, informed consent laws, and contemporary medical ethics exist because the Third Reich demonstrated what happens when science is untethered from morality. Every clinical trial today is haunted by these lessons. Every ethical review board is a response to this collapse. And yet, the temptation remains. Technology advances faster than ethics. Power still seeks efficiency. The experiments of the Third Reich were buried not because they failed, but because they succeeded in revealing something profoundly dangerous, that under certain conditions, human beings can be reduced, controlled, and broken with terrifying precision. The war ended, the flags fell, the camps were liberated. But the knowledge survived, fragmented, hidden, absorbed into systems that prefer not to remember where it came from. The victims did not survive in the same way. Their names faded, their graves remained unmarked, their suffering became footnotes. History does not repeat itself through spectacle, it repeats itself through silence. And silence, as this story proves, can be the most dangerous experiment of all.
Where the official record ends, another history begins. One written not in ink, but in consequences. The experiments of the Third Reich did not vanish with the rubble of Berlin. They migrated. They embedded themselves quietly into post-war institutions, doctrines, and assumptions about what science was allowed to become when shielded by secrecy. The world told itself that the horror was over, but the methodologies survived, stripped of insignia and ideology, reborn under new flags. In the years immediately following the war, Allied intelligence agencies conducted a silent audit of the Reich's scientific corps. Laboratories were catalogued, personnel assessed, research evaluated not by morality, but by utility. Reports were ranked according to strategic value. Hypothermia data became aviation medicine. Altitude death tables became aerospace physiology. Chemical exposure studies became defensive countermeasures. The suffering that produced them was treated as an unfortunate but irreversible sunk cost. This process fundamentally altered the ethical architecture of post-war science. The question was no longer, should this knowledge exist, but now that it exists, who controls it? Governments learned that secrecy itself was a technology, one capable of insulating power from accountability. Files were classified not to protect the public, but to protect institutions from the implications of what they now possessed. The survivors understood this long before historians did. Many reported that after liberation, they were questioned not as victims, but as repositories. Investigators wanted details, measurements, reactions. Pain was interrogated for precision. Trauma was mined for usable insight. Once extracted, the survivors were often discarded, their continued existence inconvenient to the narrative of moral victory. Psychological damage proved especially disruptive. Former prisoners described fragmented time,
intrusive commands echoing years later, involuntary obedience triggered by authority figures. These were not incidental effects, they were outcomes. The experiments had demonstrated that personality itself could be destabilized, identity weakened, memory reshaped. Post-war psychologists quietly incorporated these observations into emerging theories of conditioning and compliance, rarely acknowledging their origin. Meanwhile, the absence of complete records created a vacuum filled by denial. As decades passed, skepticism replaced outrage. If no document existed, some argued, perhaps the events had been exaggerated. If no names were attached, perhaps responsibility was diffused. This was not ignorance, it was erosion by design. Destruction of evidence is not merely concealment, it is a strategy for shaping future belief. This pattern extended beyond Germany. The moral compromise that excused Nazi data normalized similar behavior elsewhere. In the Cold War environment, ethical boundaries were reframed as obstacles to survival. Human experimentation did not end, it became bureaucratic, abstracted, euphemized. Words like trial, exposure, and assessment replaced test subject. Consent became procedural rather than meaningful. What the Third Reich revealed was not an anomaly of evil, but a vulnerability in modern civilization. When authority, fear, and technological ambition converge, ethical collapse does not announce itself, it arrives incrementally, wrapped in paperwork and justification. The camps were not born overnight, they were the final expression of a process that began with small exemptions, tolerated shortcuts, and dehumanizing language. The deeper danger lies not in remembering what happened, but in misunderstanding why it was possible. The perpetrators were not monsters in isolation, they were professionals operating within a system that rewarded results and punished dissent. The most disturbing lesson is not that humans can commit atrocities, but that institutions can normalize them. Even today, debates around classified research, military science, and emergency powers echo the same logic. Exceptional circumstances are invoked, oversight is postponed, transparency is deemed impractical, and once again, the public is asked to trust that those behind closed doors will restrain themselves. History suggests otherwise. The experiments of the Third Reich were too dangerous to survive, not because they failed, but because they succeeded in mapping the terrain of human vulnerability with ruthless clarity. They demonstrated how pain can be systematized, how obedience can be engineered, how identity can be dismantled under controlled conditions. That knowledge did not disappear. It was absorbed, diluted, and recontextualized, but never truly rejected. What remains today is an uncomfortable inheritance. Every ethical safeguard in modern research exists because someone once removed it. Every consent form is a reaction to its absence. Every memorial stands not only for the dead, but for the realization that progress without conscience is indistinguishable from destruction. The silence that followed the war was not emptiness, it was full, heavy with decisions made quietly, with truths deemed inconvenient, with victims remembered selectively. And silence, sustained long enough, becomes history's most effective collaborator. The real question is not whether humanity has learned from these experiments. The question is whether we have merely learned how to hide them better. And that question remains unanswered.